Okay, we're going to start reading our Gemara. I hope you found it interesting. Tanu Rabbanan, Hakol chayavim ba'arba'a kosot halalu, echad anashim, ve'echad nashim, ve'echad tinokot. So we have a very strange braita that we start off with. It says here that all are obligated in 4 kosot, men, women. Okay, we learned that last week, and tinokot, and children. Okay, tinokot even sounds like babies. Obviously, it doesn't mean babies here. It means children. This seems very odd, right? Children drink wine. Seems like a strange thing. So what we're going to have to try to figure out is what exactly, right? What's not surprising here. And sometimes when you see something surprising in the Gemara, the idea is you have to keep going because even though it sounds surprising, maybe the Gemara is going to grapple with the fact that this is surprising. And in fact, the next line that we get is Amar Rabbi Yehuda, he says, what on earth is kids going to do with wine? Totally irrelevant for them. So he says, instead, what do? We give out roasted or toasted grains and nuts. Okay, that's why if you live in Israel, you know that all the kids come home and gone with these nuts. You wonder, what on earth is that, right? That comes from this Gemara. Okay, so you should give them nuts on Erev Pesach so that, now what's the point? So that they don't sleep and they ask. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out, we're not going to read on past here for right now, or the truth is we could read one more line. Amru alav Rabbi Akiva, it was said about Rabbi Akiva, shaya machalek klayot be'egozim letinakot be'erev Pesach kedei shelo yishnu v'yishalu. So now we see that also Rabbi Akiva, was said about him that he also did exactly what Rabbi Yehuda said. And then the next 2 braitot I'm going to save because those 2 braitot are going to be the subject of the second part of Chavruta today. So now the question is, what's this issue about concern that the children will sleep and ask questions? So we're going to go a little bit more in depth into this whole issue and what's going on. And the question is, what exactly is the debate between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda? So if we start looking at the sources, the first thing I pointed out here in the question number 1C was the difference between don't sleep and ask questions. Okay, if you noticed, some of the sources that come after say we just don't want the children to sleep. It didn't say we don't want them to sleep and they'll ask questions. So there seems to be a little bit of a difference between sleep, just that we want them awake, and also that we want them to ask questions. There might be a bit of a distinction. We'll get back to this soon. So now we look at the Rashbam, and the Rashbam tries to explain Tanna Kama. Now, why does Tanna Kama say tinokot are obligated to have 4 cups of wine? He says very simply, shagam heim nigalu. Now, this sounds very familiar. This sounds, they were redeemed. This sounds very much like, interestingly, not what the Rashbam said about women, but what Tosfot said about women, if you remember from last week. Since they were redeemed, they have to be part of the mitzvah of the 4 cups. So therefore, because they were redeemed, they have to be part of this evening just like everybody else. Now, that seems a little bit different than a different approach that we're going to see, which is, according to this, children are obligated in the mitzvah just like everybody else, to which Rabbi Yehuda's response, according to the Rashbam, is, okay, I'm going to leave this point aside. This was just a side point about how, remember, the Rashbam said the women were the movers and the shakers, right? They made things happen. They were the leaders, whereas that's why they were obligated. The children are not obligated because they were leaders. The children are obligated because they were part of the miracle. Now, if we look on in the Rashbam, when he explains Rabbi Yehuda, basically Rabbi Yehuda is coming to entirely disagree with Tanna Kama. What we're going to do here, I'll already tell you, is we're going to set up 2 different readings of how to read the Machloket Tanna Kama and the Rabbi Yehuda. So according to the Rashbam, Tanna Kama comes and says, kids have to drink wine because they were redeemed just like everybody else. The Rashbam says that now when he says Rabbi Yehuda and says, Kimato ele yesh letinokot, what on earth are they going to do with wine? He says it's not what you would have thought. Wine, children, right? Kids don't drink wine. Halo p'turim min hamitzvot. He says, I disagree with you entirely. You say that children are obligated in the mitzvah of the Seder. And I say, what are you talking about? Kids are never obligated in mitzvah. There's no such thing as children being obligated. We all know that's what a bar bat mitzvah is all about. That's when children become obligated, although we'll learn today that that's not exactly true. Okay, certainly not in their day, but we'll get to that soon. But he says they're exempt from mitzvot, so you can't possibly obligate them. Just because they were redeemed doesn't mean they're obligated in mitzvot. And that's what Rabbi Yehuda comes to say. Now, what's the weakness of this approach? Well, what did Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda said, well, since there's no point for children in wine, let's give them these toasted grains and nuts. Now, according to the Rashbam's explanation, the discussion is, are they obligated? Are they not obligated? Once they're not obligated, so why are we giving them nuts? Right? What does that have to do with anything? So you'd have to say that according to the Rashbam, well, we still want them to be a part of things. And how do we get kids to be a part of things? We give them out candy, right? Instead of candy, so it's toasted grains, which are kind of candy-like, and the nuts. So that's basically what how the Rashbam reads it. Rabbeinu David has a very different approach. And what he says is that the approach is, so first he quotes the Rashbam. Okay, Rabbeinu David is from Spain. We've seen his commentary before. He says here, Halo p'tulim min hamitzvot. He quotes the Rashbam, Rabbeinu Shmuel. And then he says, Im ken, my time in Tanakama deka'ama echad nashim ve'echad tinokot. What is the purpose of Tanakama, if we're going to say that, to have said women and children? He says, the Rashbam makes no sense, the Tanakama, according to the Rashbam. It's true, Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, you're wrong, there's no chiyuv of mitzvah, but what did Tanakama think? That tinokot are obligated in mitzvah? Because he explained, that's what he explains. And it's just simply not true what the Rashbam said. Okay, he goes out a little bit strongly. He says, you can't possibly say that just because they were redeemed, now they're obligated. Children are never obligated in mitzvah. So he has a different approach. And he says, obviously what's going on here wasn't, were they obligated? And then Rabbi Yehuda said, no, they're not obligated. And then somehow all of a sudden he comes up with, oh yeah, and let's give them some nuts. But he explains it very differently. And not only is he going to explain it differently, but the reaction of Rabbi Yehuda and how he relates to Tanakama is also different methodologically. We'll get back to that point soon. So Tanakama says they should drink 4 cups. That no one can argue with. That's what Tanakama said. The question, the debate is really why. Oh, this is what we call din chinuch. That's how, children do lots of mitzvot all throughout. And that's because we are teaching them how to do mitzvot for when they get older. It's part of the laws of chinuch. They should have, and if you look around your table at the Seder, all the kids have wine. And that's because it's just, everyone has wine because we want to teach them. Again, this is according to Rabbeinu David, so that they'll understand that this is part of the evening. And then Al-Zeh Shiv Rabbi Yehuda. And then Rabbi Yehuda's response is probably more what you thought when you read it in the first place, which is V'chimata alele tinokot b'yayin she'en nehenim dismechim bahem ve'en lahem derech chirut. Now, there's a few things going on in this line. Number one, he says, what's the point of giving children wine? Children don't drink wine. It doesn't do anything for them. Right? In fact, usually they give them wine and they spit it out. Not always true in my house. I have a younger one who loves drinking wine, but most kids don't love drinking wine. And the point is that what is this din chinuch? What are we trying to involve the kids? Well, remember, what have we discussed the last few weeks? What's the purpose of the wine? One of the purposes is that we feel this idea of freedom. So now the idea is, well, if you want kids to feel freedom, and now here comes the nuts, it's perfect. If you want the kids to feel freedom, it's not through wine, it's through something that speaks to them. And now he says, there's no such, what's chinuch? And this is, I said, we get back to this. In our day, we always say children are obligated mitzvah when boys at 13 and girls at 12. But really, in the time of the Mishnah, it was all depending on when you reach that appropriate age. Theoretically, what the Rabbeinu David is saying, right, if the legal age for drinking is, let's say, 18 or 21, depending on where you live, then lo higiu lechinuch lekach, right? Kol hamitzvot zman chinucham shetegia sheyeda la'asota kol echad kemoshi. So the laws of chinuch are, do it when you're ready for it, when you understand it, when it means something to you. So kids, theoretically, it sounds like according to this mitzvah, they might have to actually be even older to actually do this mitzvah properly, not even 13, right? Most of the laws are actually younger, like they take a lulav when they can already understand the concept of a lulav, and they bench when they already understand the concept of benching. And all these come at actually a younger age than 12 or 13. But this one actually, interestingly, comes out different. So I want to just talk for a quick minute methodologically what the difference is between the Rashbam and Rabbeinu David. The Rashbam said they're actually obligated, and because they're obligated, right, he says they're obligated. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I disagree with you, they're not obligated. And then, okay, well, we can give them something else. But Rabbeinu David, according to him, Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda actually agree in theory on the concept. They both think that the children need chinuch. It's just that the Tanakama says you do it with wine, and Rabbi Yehuda says, no, wine isn't chinuch for them. You need to give them something different. So he agrees with him in theory that the children need midin chinuch. It's just that he changes the medium as to what it is they actually need. Okay, so that's the analysis of those two approaches that we saw. Now we're going to move to the Halache in the Shohana. So the Shohana says two different things, really. He paskins both like Rabbi Yehuda and like Tanakama, because he says, Tinokot she'igiu lechinuch mitzvah litein lechol echad koso lefanav. When they reach the age that you can already teach them, so you have to give each one a cup. Mitzvah lechalek letinokot klayot ve'egozim kedei shiru shinui v'yishalu. But then he also says that we have to give them these roasted grains and nuts. So it seems strange. Why is he paskening both like Tanakama and like Rabbi Yehuda? So the Mishnah Brura, which is written by the Chavetz Chaim in the 19th century, he says, in Russia, I forgot to write that, he says, mitzvah litein aval eino ma'akev. Says it's not critical. It's good to give them wine, and this is what we all do at the Seder, but are they really obligated? No, they're not really obligated. And that's why we also give them the klayot and egozim that speak to them much more. So he basically resolves it by saying, don't worry, the paskins like two people, it's fine. It's not really, you don't really have to do it. That's the first. Then we have the Shulchan Aruch Harav of Rav Shneur Zalman of Ladi. He was the founder of Chabad. He basically says, if you read between the lines, he says, Afak Tanim Chayav. First of all, it's a very beautiful source. He talks about the importance of chinuch at the Seder. He says, Aktanim Chayav avihem lechancham b'mitzvot lahashkotam kosot ala seder sheyitba'el. The fathers have to teach their children to drink the cups according to the order. And now he goes back to what we learned before about the importance of the order, right? Before we focused on the freedom, this is really the importance of the order. And he starts to say it's not higia lechinuch, like I mentioned before, about drinking. And when you understand what drinking is, he says it's each cup represents something in the Seder. So he says you have to, when they know and understand enough to read, to understand what we're saying on the cups, like they understand Minyan Kedushat Yom Tov, they understand what Kiddush is, then they have to hear Kiddush. When they understand Masha Mesaplim Lehem Yetziat Mitzrayim, they can understand the story of the Exodus while you say the Haggadah. So you have to have them hear that on the second cup. When they understand about Birkat HaMazon, so they have to say the third cup. And when they understand about Hallel and Nishmat that we say at the end, so then you have to explain to them that. Now, he doesn't exactly say this directly, but I think that he's addressing the contradiction in the Shulchan Aruch, which isn't really such a contradiction, because if we go back to the Shulchan Aruch, and if you pay careful attention, he says, children that reach the age of chinuch get a cup. And then you could read the next one, the next seif, the next section is saying, mitzvah lechalek letinokot klayot ve'egozim, and maybe they're talking about two different kinds of children. Little children get the klayot and egozim, and older children get a cup. Now, we happen to do both, right? Even little kids at our Seder get cups. And it could be a third possible answer is the Shulchan Aruch often doesn't, the Shulchan Aruch isn't bothered, like we might be bothered, okay, we have one approach, we want to be consistent within that approach, or we have a different approach. The Shulchan Aruch often paskins things. His idea was to kind of take everything that's been written and let's come up with, okay, what do we have to do practically? And often he takes a few different things that might actually be mutually exclusive because it's either that or that, according to the Gemara. But he says, no, let's just do all of it. Okay, so it's possible to read it in that way. Okay, now I want to move on to the last question, which is, until what time do the children need to stay up? And this is very interesting because the Mishnah Berurah says something kind of fun. It's always interesting when you see the commentaries, that we've seen this before in this class, which is you see them talk about things that are going on around them and how they address it. And particularly in the second part of today's class, we're going to see a lot of that. So before we even read the Mishnah Berurah, we already had an answer to that according to the Shohana Aruch Harav. What did he say? Until what time do the children need to stay up? So he basically said, once they understand, they basically have to stay up for all the 4 cups, because if they can understand something that's going on at the Seder, they can understand how to bench, they understand how to do Hallel, then they already have to stay up for all those 4 things. Okay, keep this in mind when we go on in the second part of the night. The Mishnah Berurah, though, says something interesting. He says, we want them to ask, right? The Gemara had said, or the Bright had said, Kedei sheyishnu shelo yishnu, they won't sleep, v'yisha'alu. So it sounds like, what's the important part? That they ask questions. When do we ask the questions? Manishtana, at the beginning of the Seder. So he says, Sarich la'oreram shelo yishnu ad achar avadim hayinu. He says you have to keep them up at least long enough to say avadim hayinu, which is really at the very beginning of the Seder. Why does he say this? She'edu inyan yetziat Mitzrayim. Right? It's not enough for them to ask. It really means that they won't sleep and they'll ask and they'll get an answer. He says the ikara mitzvah is not that they ask, it's hatshuva al she'elat beno. The mitzvah of the night, what's the main mitzvah of the night? And this is, I assume you all thought about this before, which is, why is it so important to keep the children up? Because it says, you're supposed to tell your children on that day, right, that God took me out of Egypt. And he points out here, velo kemoshe osim eza hamon, and not like a lot of people do. And this is fascinating to read. As soon as manishtana is over, they're like, okay, kids, you've done what you need to do, right? You did your performance, go to sleep now. And he basically says, the great line, ve'enam yodim tshuva l'she'elatam, right? And they have no idea then what their answer is. So he ends with this great thing that basically people think it's all about asking the questions. And the truth is, if you read the simple answer of the reading of the Gemara, it sounds like we don't want them sleeping so that they ask the question. But really, he says it's not about the question, it's about what the question leads to and the discussion and the answer. Now, it's interesting that he says, then avadim hayinu is sufficient. As long as you get the basic answer, we were slaves, then you understand. However, obviously, there's more to it than that. And, and the Shohana Aruch Harav goes on to say you really need the whole, right? The whole Seder is really, and that's what many of us try to at least keep our kids up as long as we can and keep them engaged throughout the Seder, because we view this is a whole night experience of, and then what we saw here were elements of, we want them to experience freedom, right? They're part of that whole obligation of experiencing freedom. So if they're not going to experience it through wine, we need to come up with an alternative. And they're also part of this whole experience of telling them the story. And they need to ask, and therefore they need to then get an answer. And that's very important. But it's interesting to note that he claims, avadim hayinu, that's sufficient. I was thinking about it because at the Seder often, and I don't know what goes on in your house, but often there's a lot of discussion in the beginning. There's a lot of questions in the Manishtana, and we ask questions on that. And then we talk about, in the beginning part, the 4 sons and the different types of things about the 4 sons. And by the time we get to the main part of the Seder, which is really the telling of the story. And when does the telling of the story happen? When we quote those verses, Arami Oved Avi, and we start darshaning them, and there's all these drashot there. Okay, we'll get to this when we get to the Mishnayot later in the chapter. That's the central part of the Haggadah. Most people by that point have had enough, and they read through that part quickly and they move on. And it's kind of ironic because that's the real part of the story. And it reminded me of that when I read the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, everyone's so excited for the kids to say Manishtana as if that's that's what it's all about. But it's not. That's just the beginning, the tasters, right? And even the parts after Manishtana. So yes, avadim hayinu is a type of answer, but there's more answers that come later. And the real base of the answer is in learning those psukim, which happen to be from Sefer Dvarim, and then we darshan them, and then we get to the whole story, and we tell the story through that. And that's the main part. And sometimes people miss the point, okay? Today, we're going to learn about all different kinds of customs that sometimes cause people to miss the point or maybe go off in a way that maybe isn't the best way appropriate. You'll see that in the second part of today's class. So I'm going to send you back to Chavrutot now. And And I'm sorry that I didn't have a chance to read the chats while I was, I'll try to read them while you're in Chavruta, and I'll see if I can address them maybe in the beginning of the second section. So now I'm going to send you to Chavruta, or if you're learning online, so now's the time to start Chavruta number 2.